Today's speaker is John Smithin, Research Director of the Aurora Philosophy Institute and Professor Emeritus and Senior Scholar at York University, Toronto. His topic is the nature of money, conflict, and the rise and fall of empires. John is the author or editor of 16 books, including most recently Debates in Monetary Macroeconomics, 2022, Beyond Butter, also in 2022, and Rethinking the Theory of Money, Credit, and Macroeconomics, 2018. Over to you, John.
Well, thank you, Ella, for that very nice introduction. So the first thing that I had better do then is to share the screen because I do have some PowerPoints to go with this talk. So let me just go ahead and do that. Here we go. So this is the title screen. And as Alice said, the title of the talk is The Nature of Money, Conflict, and the Rise and Fall of Empires. I want to make three main points, that is, talk about three main topics and try to link them together. The first, obviously, is the relationship between money and war or conflict. Surely it is not simply that money is the root of all evil, or that capitalism or profit is inherently immoral, or anything like that. But then what is the connection exactly? Second topic is Sir John Glubb's well-known thesis that empires or political regimes last around 250 years on average. So as I say, this seems like a problem for contemporary America. The USA was founded in 1776 and it is now 2026. Finally, the third topic is a case study of the British Empire. And here the Glubb thesis seems to work. There were exactly 250 years between the founding of the Bank of England in 1694 and the ceding of hegemony to the USA at the Bretton Woods Financial Conference in 1944. The case of Britain validates the money-financial connection. By the way, the post-war globalist financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, etc., were originally set up at Bretton Woods, but as we all know, now that whole globalist structure is itself in grave jeopardy. The next slide is just a picture of the Bank of England, and this is where the British Empire was born in 1694. There are a couple of remarks I would like to make about this image. First of all, the Bank of England is in London, obviously, and yet this is a bright, sunny day. What are the chances of that? It's just an odd thing. You would expect to see a picture of London. It would be grey and raining and so forth, as it usually is. More substantively, I do find it very significant that the flag which is flying over the Bank of England is actually the imperial flag, the flag of Great Britain, the so-called Union Jack. Now, as an Englishman myself, albeit one who has been in exile for more than 50 years, I sort of would expect or would have liked to see the flag of England, the Cross of St. George, flying over an institution which is called the Bank of England, but it is not. And I think that is very indicative to a very large degree of some of the topics, some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. The next slide shows the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, USA, and this is where the British Empire came to die in 1944. This photo is not photoshopped, I am sure. There is a very great deal of snow in northern New Hampshire, and it lasts very long into the year. I've been there myself for conferences and things and can attest that that is exactly what it is like. A very nice spot, by the way, for a conference, even if some of the things that happen there were not so good in the end. The title of the next slide is The Nature of Money, and that's what a philosopher might call the ontology of money. And it's my contention that the concept of money is widely misunderstood in mainstream economics, in financial theory, and of course in financial history. Money is not a neutral medium of exchange that evolved from barter. It is not a gold coin, a silver coin, a copper coin, a piece of paper, or even just a piece of plastic. These artifacts, in the end, are just alternative ways of recording indebtedness. In reality, money is a social relation. To quote from an article by the Cambridge University political economist Jeff Ingham from 1996, specifically, it is a relation of indebtedness. And there are two quotes which I think sum the whole thing up. The first from Ingham again, this time from a book in 2004. And what Ingham says there is that all money is debt insofar as issuers promise to accept their own money for any debt payment by any bearer of the money. Then from the Nobel Prize winning economist Sir John Hicks from 1989. Money is, and I've interpolated, what is paid for a discharge of debt when that debt has been expressed in terms of money. Now, this might seem like circular reasoning, but it seems to me that it is precisely to the point. If, for example, a judgment is made against me in court that I owe someone $20,000, I have to come up with $20,000. I cannot give 20,000 marshmallows or 20,000 matchboxes. And the question is always what actually counts as $20,000 in any given set of circumstances. These days, all that happens is I transfer, if I pay my debt, I transfer economic impulses from my electronic bank account to somebody else's electronic bank account. It's all done with a push of the button on the computer keyboard. But we treat it as money. We think it's a real thing. We count it as money. Now, in the case of the state, the political entity which rules over us, the state has the power to tax. And all it has to do to validate its own money is to always accept its own money back in payment of taxes. The mantra of so-called modern monetary theory, or MMT, a school of thought of monetary economists in the USA, is that taxes drive money. That is their slogan. And I think they're quite right about this. The next thing I've put on here is a stylized bank balance sheet. Now, this could be a commercial bank, a central bank, as we've just been discussing, or any other similar type of financial institution. The point is just that balance sheets balance. Balance sheets must balance by definition. That is to say, assets equal liabilities. Now, money is, as we've just said, a subset of the items on the liabilities side of bank balance sheets. What I've called the redeemable deposits. They're the bank accounts that we all use on a daily basis. It follows from this type of balance sheet is that if there needs to be overall more money to spend on whatever one needs or wants to buy, there must be an expansion on the liabilities side. The implication is quite clearly that there needs to be an increase on the asset side also. There needs to be credit creation. Credit creation implies money creation. The bank would need to make loans or purchase other assets, for example, buy bonds, in order that money appears at all on the liabilities side of the bank balance sheet. Now, this seems to me to give rise to two possible sources of conflict. And I'm just going to be talking very simply here, just in sort of almost, if you like, sort of common sense terms. The first source of conflict could simply be that there's not enough money to go around. There's not enough money in existence, and we fight over, we're in conflict over whatever small amount of money is there that's available for us. And the problem here, it seems to me, is that also everything that conventional economics recommends tend to restrict credit creation, to restrict the supply of money, and thus, by causing a shortage, tends to cause conflict over that short supply. I can mention things such as the old gold standard, of which much more later. Policies of high interest rates. High interest rates would tend to reduce the incentive for people to take out loans. The old shibboleth of balanced budgets. Obviously, if you balance the budgets, there is no need for loans or borrowing, and hence no increase on the asset side of bank balance sheets. Another restrictive thing is the single currency, the euro in Europe, which was explicitly designed to reduce the amount of credit creation that goes on in Europe, and on and on and on. All of the sort of views of conventional economic theory seem to militate in this direction, and as I say, tend literally to cause conflict. The second thing I would like to talk about is the international balance of payments. And that obviously is particularly relevant to this notion of empire building. So, what is the international balance of payments? Well, the balance of payments is the record of a nation's transactions with the outside world during an accounting period, a given accounting period, such as a quarter or a year. It is the sum across the capital account and the current account. If there is no change in foreign exchange reserves, then it follows simply by definition that the current account is the negative of the capital account and vice versa. This is a basic principle, and we can easily see that even when changes in foreign exchange are not zero, this basic principle is still going to apply. The changes in foreign exchange reserves would have to be very large indeed to upset this basic principle, and typically that does not happen. Now, the current account is exports minus imports, whereas the capital account represents international capital flows, international borrowing and lending, and international direct investment. If exports are greater than imports, then the capital account is negative. They will say that the capital account is negative. This sounds like a bad thing for the domestic economy, but in fact, all it means is that the money that has been made from the exports being greater than imports has to find an outlet somewhere. So when that circumstance happens, the nation will invest, so to speak, in foreign countries. Now, one can easily see that in historical circumstances, that investment could take the form of ships and guns and migration and the building up of infrastructure overseas. And come to think about it, I'm talking about historical circumstances. Why actually bother to use that qualifier historical? Think about the contemporary world scene. Isn't that exactly what's going on today in many cases? Is there a way out? Well, possibly, potentially. I would like to suggest that a possible way out is a system of sovereign non-reserve currencies with floating exchange rates. By the way, I'm grateful to Matthias Delucci of the Central Bank of Argentina for this terminology. Matthias is also an API associate and will take place in the discussion, which is going to take place later on. He and I have been talking about what might be the correct terminology for the last few months. So a sovereign currency is just one which is in controlled by a sovereign government, the Canadian dollar, and they issue their liabilities in Canadian dollars and so forth. A non-reserve currency is a currency which other nations do not typically hold as part of their international financial reserves. And we'll talk about the floating exchange rates later. And I'm going to raise the question, is this the system that the BRICS, the so-called BRICS, BRICS, are currently setting up? The BRICS means Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This is an international trading group, and in recent years, in the last 4 years, they have been joined by many other countries also. These nations do not want to, or in some cases literally cannot, use the present international reserve currency, the US dollar. That obviously is true of Russia, for example. So these countries just now trade bilaterally. They trade Russian rubles for Chinese yuan, for example, allowing exchange rates to adjust. So in principle, if the exchange rates are allowed to adjust fully, the capital account and the current account might be able to get into balance within each jurisdiction. Now, I've been advocating some kind of system like this for 40, almost coming on for 50 years. I don't have a reserve currency and just trade bilaterally with your neighbors using each of your own currencies. And to some extent, the BRICS have, as it were, been forced into this. So this system, is not fully up and running yet. It is working, obviously, for those nations, as we speak. And I would just like to draw your attention to the Kazan meeting in 2025. There was a meeting of the various BRICS partners in Kazan in Russia in 2025. And the purpose was precisely to work out the details of what the future system might look like, how it might develop, and so on and so forth. And I'd like to draw analogies to the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 that we talked about before. 1944 was towards the end of World War II. It was the year before World War II ended. It's very likely, and what they were doing was trying to determine the shape of the future world after the war had ended. At this time, there's also a war going on, the war between Russia and Ukraine, in which the USA is also heavily involved, and whether 2025 would be the year before the end of this war or not, we don't know as yet. But it seems that was designed to, how can I put it, to shape what the future post-war world might look like. So that might be a way out of this conundrum that we've just mentioned. I want to now turn to past regimes which first of all seemed to succeed and then finally failed. And the next slide is called The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival. And this is the title of a book by Sir John Glubb Pasha, written in 1976. Now, Glubb knew what he was talking about, specifically the collapse of the British Empire. Glubb was a former British Army officer who, in the post-World War II period, worked for King Abdullah of Jordan. And famously, he was the commander of the Arab Legion in the war with Israel in 1948. So Glubb's thesis was that empires or political regimes last on average about 250 years. And there are many historical examples that Glubb was able to cite. Obviously, he had the British Empire very much in mind, as you might expect. And here's a picture of Sir John Glubb on horseback on this occasion, uh, leading the Arab Legion in a parade. Now let's think about this notion of the lifespan of empires. Well, I think there is a temptation to interpret it in psychological, sociological, or even biological terms. For example, 250 years encompasses the lifespan of three octogenarians, which I almost am myself. So the idea might be, therefore, that the first generation is strong and progressive, the second is complacent, and the third is weak, etc., etc. You see the idea. Well, maybe there is something in this, but in my opinion, it does not really work on closer inspection. Obviously, there are overlapping generations. There are all sorts of generations alive at the present time. Importantly, from my point of view, there is no allowance for learning or the intellect. For example, it rules out the possibility of someone writing a brilliant book on geopolitics, shall we say, which changes everyone's mind and causes them to change their activities. And I think, above all, um, although it so happens that the British Empire has these very neat 250-year dates. In general, this 250-year time span is only an average. Some regimes are much shorter, some are much longer by another 100 years or more, and so on. So the question is, should we be looking for some other factor aside from these purely almost mechanical ideas, such as precisely the financial issues? And so we'll turn then to the timeline of the British Empire, um, which might help us to see the argument a little bit more clearly. As we mentioned, the year 1694, that was the founding of the Bank of England. In 1707, when the Bank of England was founded, the state of Great Britain itself didn't even exist. Um, it was only in 1707 that the state of Great Britain itself came into being with the Act of Union between uh, England and Scotland. During that period, um, from 1701 to 1714, Britain was involved in a major war, most of which was on the European continent, but some of which was in overseas territories as well, the so-called War of the Spanish Succession. And in the end, Britain came out as the victor of that. Basically, England or Britain, whichever you will, created the financial architecture to enable them to provide the finance to conduct these wars. And it seemed to work very rapidly. 20 years after the founding of the Bank of England, by 1714, Great Britain was a world power, which it had not been earlier. In the next sort of major set of wars, again, um, Great Britain had the financial wherewithal to fund these wars. The next major set of wars were the 7 Years' War, which many people have said was the first world war. It took place on multiple continents. In North America, the 7 Years' War was known as the so-called French and Indian Wars. And from our point of view here in Canada, this was the year in which Canada was indeed conquered, taken over by Great Britain. The next episode is a curious one, the American War of Independence, or the American Revolution, whereby the English colonies in what is now the United States of America gained their independence from Britain. And again, this sort of tension, isn't there, between England and Britain. Um, the but you would think that the American War of Independence would have been like a major blow. It would have put an end to Britain's hopes to be a world power. But in fact, this did not finish off the imperial project by any means. The British seemed not to skip a beat after losing the American colonies. There was another major set of wars in the period from 1792 to 1815, and this were the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. In this case, the revolution we're referring to is the French Revolution. And Britain was again victorious. Again, after the Battle of Waterloo, once again, they were a major voice, at the table. Oh, where? Yeah, one of my slides was out of order there. Not to worry about that. So we're continuing the timeline of the British Empire. In While that war was going on, you won't be surprised to learn by now that there was definitely a financial angle, because the period of from 1797 to 1821, which overlapped with the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, was also known as the, quote, bank restriction period. But that is a misnomer. What the Bank of England was restricted from doing was paying out on its own liabilities in gold. In short, by forbidding the Bank of England to pay out in gold, a pure credit system was set up. And again, it seems that there was a connection between the financial arrangements and the successful prosecution of war. The next thing to which I want to draw your attention to is probably something you may not have heard of before, but in 1884, Peel's Bank Act was passed. Sir Robert Peel was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the day, and Peel's Bank Act was an act which was supposed to regulate, to dictate the activities of the Bank of England, the central bank. And that Bank Act was often seen as a triumph of what you might call orthodox financial theory, in spite of what seems to have been these successes in the past, and in spite of the fact that Britain had, risen to a position of power. The theory was that we should try to restrict credit creation by tying the money supply to gold. And so there were a number of complicated provisions about the Bank of England. They separated out into two departments, the banking department and the issue department, and so on and so forth. But that was the fundamental idea. And again, so it seems to me that by doing this, you're going to lead to conflict precisely by restricting the money supply and therefore causing people to fight over what has become a scarce resource. So just cast our mind back to the timelines again. This is 1844. We're 150 years into the British Empire. And as a matter of fact, there's only 100 years to go now before Bretton Woods, the very end. So was this Peel's Bank Act at the beginning of the end? Well, in the next 20 years or so, they came up with an expedient by which they could avoid this solution. What happened in the 20 years or so was that every time that a financial crisis loomed, every time that, I think there were three major financial crises in those years, every time a financial crisis assumed, the Bank Act was suspended. So the provisions of the Bank Act were suspended. The bank would not have to give up its gold, and the crisis would be averted, and the economy would go on its merry way. So this happened three times after 1844, but in the year 1866, that was actually the last occasion on which the Bank Act was suspended. In 1873, there was a still further movement down this road. In 1873, that was the start of the so-called International Gold Standard, whereby virtually every nation in the world was tied its currency to gold, and naturally, therefore, that implied a system of fixed exchange rates between the currencies, again, across the whole world. The crime of 73 took place in the United States. Before 1873, the United States had on several occasions during the Civil War, for example, had a fiat money system. By 1873, it was on a so-called bimetallic system, where the monetary metals were both gold and silver. The point being is that if you add silver to gold, there's so much more monetary metal going around. The crime in 1873 was that the USA demonetized silver. There would be no more silver dollars. And so that was the effective start of the International Gold Standard, which became the international monetary system for the next 50 years or so, down to World War One. Now, again, you can see the issue here is that if we're again restricted, if you're calling gold money, there isn't really enough gold to go around. But there were two mitigating circumstances in the following years. In 1866, gold was discovered in South Africa, and in 1896, gold was discovered in the Klondike. Now, the Klondike, as you may know, is actually in the Northwest Territories in Canada. Therefore, it was part of the British Empire. And as a matter of fact, in the Northwest Territories to this day, they have a sort of annual celebration, which is called Klondike Days, celebrating this event. But the point is that this was in Canada, so this is definitively a part of the British Empire. That's good. The gold is in the British Empire. Now, the earlier gold discovery in South Africa was not actually in the British Empire. In 1866, there were two provinces of South Africa, the Cape Province and Natal, which were part of the British Empire, and two which were not. These were the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, and the gold was discovered, I believe, in the Transvaal. These were the republics ruled by the Boers, Boer, the Boers, who were the original Dutch settlers of South Africa. Well, you can see the problem. And it's kind of, I'm sorry, I've now gone back on that slide again. There's gold in South Africa, but it's not in the part of South Africa which is in the British Empire. The solution, obviously, is to incorporate those two provinces into the British Empire. And in 1899 to 1902, there was the famous Boer War, as it was called, in South Africa, by which that was accomplished. And that Boer War, by the way, is something which looms large in the social history or the social memory of Britain. But, we always talk about the siege of Mafeking and all of that kind of thing. So you see, if you find more gold and you're on a gold standard, that's a good thing because it provides more money. There's more money to go around. But you can see these are temporary expedients. You're going to rely on discovering gold here and there and again and again. Eventually, push is going to come to shove, and the crunch will come. The crunch came in the shape of World War II. World War One, which was a cataclysmic event, obviously for everybody. In theory, Britain won World War One. You could argue that by 1920, the British Empire reached its maximum extent in terms of populations controlled and territory controlled, more than a quarter of the Earth's population, more than a quarter of the Earth's surface. You're including all the territories which were conquered from the Ottoman Turks during the First World War. But it was kind of the beginning of the end. Britain was somewhat exhausted by this time. And the year after 1920, the first sort of crack in the edifice came with the creation of the Irish Free State. The Irish became independent. The big economic event after that was the restored gold standard, which was in place from 1925 to 1931. Again, by the end of World War I, every country had gone off gold, and you were in a system of floating exchange rates and credit economies. But orthodox financial theory said normalcy or orthodoxy requires that every nation be on a gold standard. Britain took that upon itself, and in 1925 returned to the gold standard, and at a parity which severely overvalued the pound against the US dollar, for example, and against a number of other currencies as well. This was a disaster economically, and this was pointed out by the economist J.M. Keynes in a book called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. Churchill was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or Minister of Finance, in Britain at the time. So you had depression, 10% unemployment for a period of years, economic crisis, deindustrialization, and so on. Eventually, it all collapsed in the international financial crisis of 1931, and Britain went off gold again. But this attempt to restore the gold standard severely depressed the British economy at a time when it could not afford it. The international financial crisis, in a way, was a good thing because it did free up the British economy to reindustrialize and rearm to some extent in the later 1930s, and they were in a position, to enter into World War II. But as we've just pointed out, the end came at the Bretton Woods Financial Conference in 1944, just before the end of World War II, in which hegemony was ceded to the United States. So here's John Maynard Keynes. We just mentioned his name, famous economist of the interwar period. We just mentioned his name in the context of his book, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. He also wrote, his magnum opus was The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money in 1936, trying to make sense of a world which, from his point of view, had gone mad. And he was the chief negotiator at Bretton Woods in 1944, the chief British negotiator at Bretton Woods in 1944. I don't think this was not his finest hour. The deal that he came away with was not a good deal, although, as people do, he tried to defend it valiantly in the British Parliament later that year. In the end, he didn't live to see the consequences of what had happened at Bretton Woods, because he passed away from a heart attack just a couple of years later in 1946. The last thing I just want to touch on is this question of how did Canada hold up after the collapse of the British Empire? Well, of course, Canada was the largest of the British dominions and is still the second largest country in the world. The resources of Canada are abundant. And moreover, Canada seemed to do very well in the 2 decades after World War II. It's got huge advantages because of its size and because of the resources. And people have often said, it would take a real perverse genius to kind of screw that up. However, our politicians, I'm sorry to say, have succeeded in screwing it up, at least at least for the 50 years and more that I've been here, and no doubt for the foreseeable future. In any event, Lament for a Nation was the title of a famous book by the Canadian philosopher George Grant that was published in 1965. He was referring to the various political events of the 1960s. For example, every Canadian will know about this, the cancellation of the Avro Arrow airplane, which would have provided Canada with independent deterrence, military deterrent. It was extremely advanced technologically. It relied on a very extensive base of technological and engineering knowledge which existed in Canada at that time, but was cancelled at the behest of the United States. There was also the Auto Pact. The issue there was that instead of developing a Canadian automobile industry, what would happen is that American cars would be built in Canadian cities. So the Canadian automobile industry consists in building American cars, but in factories in Canada. So you see, you're not developing your own indigenous expertise and technical know-how. As a result of these events, George Grant thought that the political elites in Ontario and Quebec, the group that he called the Laurentian elites, had sold out, or so to speak. I don't recall if he mentioned the fixing of the exchange rate in 1962, when Canada very belatedly joined the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. And we've already suggested that flexible exchange rates are better. Now, that fixed exchange rate was over by the year 1970, but maybe the damage had been done by then. In any event, was George Grant right? Was Canada essentially all over by the year 1965? What do people think about this? I would like to know what people think about this. My last penultimate slide is a picture of George Grant in his office. I believe this was at McMaster University, which is an institution of which I have the honor to also be a doctoral graduate. So that's George Grant. And the final slide refers to another extremely important Canadian institution, namely the Aurora Philosophy Institute, which was established in 2019. That's us. And here is the address of the YouTube channel and the address of the website, etc. Well, so thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing now, and we can move on to the question period. Thanks a lot.